the question is, were Daniel and his three friends eunuchs? We're in the book of Daniel, chapter 1. So we're going to pick it up at verse 3 here. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family, royal bloodlines, footnote, Hebrew of the seed of the kingdom, and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, who are the Babylonians. So the English word eunuch comes from the Greek, evnuchos, and this guy's the arch-evnuchos, the arch-eunuch, the head of the eunuchs, and he's really the chief of the eunuchs, commander of the eunuchs, like Game of Thrones, right? They had that eunuch army in Game of Thrones. The King James says the master of his eunuchs, the chief of the eunuchs, the leader, the team leader of Team Eunuch, Captain Eunuch. But it's important to realize that the chief of the eunuchs was the leader of other eunuchs on Team Eunuch, because the eunuchs back then were in the inner circle. They would be like the White House staff today, more than we could possibly imagine. So basically what happened is that Babylon would go around to, they'd conquer, and this happened with other nations as well. They'd conquer a nation, they'd take their stuff, and they'd also take the best people. And Daniel and his friends were probably teenagers at the time, and they were from the elite families and whatnot, and they were healthy and intelligent. These Jewish kids were taken to Babylon to be indoctrinated, assimilated into Babylonian society. So it says here, they brought them to the king's palace to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, who are basically the Babylonians, who had extensive literature and language and culture and all this kind of stuff. And these kids were basically smart and young, and they could be transformed into productive members of Babylonian society. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. Okay, almost like a university degree, right? They're going to be indoctrinated and educated and transformed into Babylonians over the course of 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All of them had Yahweh-related names of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. So you have the chief of the eunuchs changing their names. They're being transformed from Jews into Babylonians by changing the names. What else is being changed here? What else is this chief of the eunuchs doing to these young teenage boys? Were they also being castrated? And you may think, well, come on, man, what are you talking about? Actually, in the early church, many of the early church fathers and even the Jews believed that these 4 guys were actually castrated and became eunuchs. Why is that? Is there any biblical evidence of this? Well, there kind of is. So Isaiah 39:5, we'll start there. Isaiah, the prophet, talking to King Hezekiah, roughly 100 years before the time of Daniel. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And we see in Daniel, they took all the vessels of the house of God, right? That happened. That was fulfilled in 605 BC when the king of Babylon came and took the stuff from the temple of God, brought them to Babylon and put them in the Tower of Babel, which was the temple of Marduk. And now these young teenage boys' names are being changed to Babylonian God-related names, and they're being indoctrinated into Babylonian culture. So that prophecy was fulfilled. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, descendants of King Hezekiah, basically, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And so in Hebrew, the word is saris, and usually in Greek, it's evnuchos. But right here in Isaiah, it's using the word spadontas, which means eunuch, castrated man. So the word saris can mean official in the court of the king, but usually they were castrated. And that's why there's a bit of overlap between the word in English, should it be translated as eunuch or official? Because they were kind of both, actually. They're both correct. Sometimes there may have been officials who were not eunuchs, but most of them were. So in your English Bibles, this word appears quite dozens of times, actually. This saris word is used a lot. It's used especially when it's located near the word king or queen, because they were part of the king's inner circle. But a eunuch wasn't necessarily a transvestite. That's like the next level. This is a specific kind of person who had a specific kind of job. Now, some translations, like the LSB, we'll call it officials. Well, here's my question: is what kind of punishment is that? Remember, this is exile. They're going into exile because they broke the covenant. This is punishment. So how is it a punishment if your sons are being taken off to become high-ranking government officials in the wealthiest nation in the world? Well, that's so horrible, isn't it? No, that's not so bad. That's not a punishment, right? They will become officials. No, that makes no sense at all when the Greek says castrated male. It says eunuch in the Greek. And so this word saris is a little bit difficult. Should it be eunuch or should it be official? And the key is that we have to translate this word in context. Now here's the King James Version. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. All right, so now what we'll do, let's take a look at some passages that use this word saris and see how it's translated. So going back to Genesis 37, the story of Joseph. So the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Now we have our word saris. Now why do they call him officer here? Even King James calls this guy an officer. But if you look at the footnote, Hebrew says eunuch. But the word doth signify not only eunuchs, but also chamberlains, courtiers, and officers. Now, the reason they use officer here is because this guy had a wife. However, sometimes eunuchs did get married. And what's interesting in this case is that Potiphar's wife starts to hit on Joseph because Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." So Potiphar apparently wasn't satisfying his wife. And is it possible that Potiphar was also a eunuch who was married and his wife was hitting on Joseph, which kind of indicates that Joseph was not a eunuch. Some people believe Joseph was also a eunuch, but probably not, because of the women are hitting on Joseph. Now, the same Hebrew word, saris, is used when talking about King David, and they use the word officer because, of course, they don't want to have eunuchs in the court of King David. However, 2 Kings 9:32, we have a eunuch in our English Bible, but this is in the court of Jezebel. 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out at him. He said, "Throw her down," so they threw her down. So the eunuchs killed Jezebel. Sometimes the eunuchs would turn on the king or the queen. So you see the wicked Jezebel, of course, had eunuchs, whereas King David had officers. But it's the same Hebrew word. Now, the same prophecy we found in Isaiah 39 appears in 2 Kings 20. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon, but some translations say officials. Oh, how horrible that would be if your sons became officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. Well, no, it would be horrible if they became eunuchs. They were conquered. See, it wasn't just something that happened to an individual person, although it did. It also meant that you could not create offspring. You would have no descendants. It's like they're castrating Judah itself. If you think about it, the Davidic bloodline was the prophesied bloodline of the Messiah. So in a way, it's almost like the Davidic bloodline, the messianic bloodline, is being cut off. That's what this prophecy is saying here. You will be eunuchs. The royal seed of kings will be cut off because the royal family will become eunuchs and the messianic prophecies will not happen. That's kind of the threat that they're under right here. It's not just that these people were being castrated, is that they could not produce offspring and some kind of messianic dynasty for the nation of Judah and also for all of Israel. So it almost looked like the promises given to Abraham were not going to be fulfilled because the sons of the kings of Judah are being turned into eunuchs in Babylon. How are they going to produce a messianic king if they're all a bunch of eunuchs? But as we know, that God often works with barren women and whatnot and produces offspring miraculously. Now, all the kings of Israel were wicked, and they usually had a bunch of wives. And when a king had a bunch of wives or a harem, the person who looked after the harem was a eunuch. That's just how it worked back then. And we know that the northern kingdom of Israel were at this point not really following Yahweh at all. And so when they say officer, which is saris in Hebrew, right there, and look at what it is in Greek, evnuko, it's eunuch. The Greek says eunuch right here. Then the king of Israel summoned a eunuch. That's what it says in Greek, all right? Now, when we get into the book of Esther, it's almost always translated as eunuch. Same word in Hebrew and Greek, and now it's called a eunuch. See, that's what I'm talking about here. We have one word in Hebrew, but there's about 3 or 4 different English words are used to translate the one Hebrew word. And so ESV says 7 eunuchs. King James says 7 chamberlains, but the Greek is eunuch. We're going to notice a pattern here. So notice the word eunuch is used in close proximity to the word king. And that's just how it was back then, and probably how it is today as well, although we have a lot of the transvestites are now kind of taking the place of the eunuch, or maybe they're both. So here we have Queen Vashti, we have the word king, and we have the word eunuch. Queen, king, eunuch. Harem, king, eunuch. The king's eunuch. So the eunuchs are basically like pets in a way. That's kind of an easy way to think of it, like my cat. So my cat is actually a eunuch. I'm sorry about that, buddy. But, that's what we do, right? We castrate. Oh, no, we neuter animals. Neuter is a little bit of a kinder word than castrate. But this is a eunuch cat, and that's what we do with our pets. We neuter them. They make better pets, and it's kind of safer for the community, and everyone's happy when your pets are neutered. But people actually do this to other people as well. It's well documented throughout history, and I believe it's still happening today. And, we do it to farm animals and whatnot. So it's what we do. These guys, Daniel and his friends, may have been neutered, castrated to work in the palace of the king. And that's basically what they did. And this right here pretty much explains the practice in the ancient world. And let the king appoint officers in all. See, this is a different Hebrew word here. In all the provinces of his kingdom, to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them. So it kind of makes sense that if you're the king and you're building a harem, you kind of want a eunuch to do that job. There's a certain method to the madness. And there's Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, mentioned just a few verses later. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. Well, there's another Marduk name right there. This is Marduk, basically, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Same context as Daniel. There's Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He took Mordecai, and he took Daniel and his friends. And now he's collecting a harem. And Esther was taken into the king's palace by the eunuch. Haggai is the eunuch, the chief of the eunuchs, the same as the other guy in the book of Daniel. And the young women pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food. And here's a different eunuch. There are multiple eunuchs in the king's court. Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the harem. In those days, as Mordecai, whose name is really Marduk, the Babylonian god, was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs. Was Mordecai a eunuch? He must have been a eunuch, for no mention is made of a wife or children of his own, and he had access to the harem, or women's quarters. So Mordecai seems to have been a eunuch as well. So we just discovered another eunuch in real time right here, much to my surprise. So notice the word eunuch is always used next to the word king. So if we read Daniel again, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch. And there were the chiefs of other eunuchs. They managed the harem of females for the king, and they managed the harem of eunuchs. Eunuchs in the ancient world, Lexham Bible Dictionary. Ancient Near Eastern cultures made frequent use of eunuchs, particularly in service to royalty. Royal leaders such as Cyrus the Great And Nebuchadnezzar sought out eunuchs as servants because he perceived them as loyal, compliant, and trustworthy around women, kind of like my cat. And there's about 20 eunuchs named in the Bible by name. Now, Nehemiah may have been a eunuch as well. Men in the service of a king who came in contact with the king's harem were usually eunuchs. Thus, Nehemiah was not only from the Jewish laity, but he was also a eunuch. That's coming from the commentary. King Solomon must have had eunuchs as well, because basically, if you have a king with a large harem, you're going to need eunuchs to take care of these women. Because remember, the Israelites were starting to become more and more just like the nations around them. And I would say it's possible that King David had eunuchs as well. The word saris is used with King David, but it's always translated as officer in the English Bibles. But it's the same Hebrew word that's translated as eunuch when it's talking about pagan kings. And King David had many wives. He kind of had a harem, not as big as Solomon's harem, but he had a harem as well. And if you have a harem, you got to have eunuchs to take care of the harem. Here's from a commentary on the book of Judith. Castrating men for service at the highest levels was a Near Eastern practice. Some eunuchs had been captured in war or were sons of slaves. Some were castrated at birth, while those designated as pleasure boys were castrated nearer to puberty. Pleasure boys, that almost sounds like a lady boy. There are references to this where they would actually dress them up like girls as well, called them androgynes. And that's probably relates to a lot of the celebrities we see today are these kind of people. It's the same thing happening today, by the way. It is also possible that Nehemiah, Daniel, and his friends, and Mordecai were eunuchs. I just discovered Mordecai was a eunuch while making this video. And this guy is saying Nehemiah and Daniel and his friends, it's possible they're eunuchs. He's saying it's possible. This is Herodotus. He's writing about the practice of eunuchs. When they had gained mastery over the cities, they chose out the most handsome boys and castrated them, making them eunuchs instead of men, and they carried the fairest maidens away to the king. They did all this, and they burnt the cities with their temples. Now, doesn't that sound a lot like the beginning of the book of Daniel? All right, so they chose out the most handsome boys and castrated them. Book of Daniel, the chief eunuch chose out boys without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom. The eunuch chose the good-looking boys, just like it says in Herodotus. They chose out the most handsome boys. The guy who chose Daniel was a eunuch. And what do you think he did to these handsome boys? He changed them to be just like him. And then it says they burnt the cities down. They besieged Jerusalem. They burned Jerusalem down, and they destroyed the temple. It's exactly what they usually did. This is exactly what the Babylonians did to Jerusalem. This was standard practice, and this was written around the time of Daniel. And the Persians and the Babylonians did very similar stuff. So it would be odd if Daniel and his friends were not castrated. No, it doesn't imply anything negative about Daniel and his friends. It just means that things were even worse for them and that they need God's help even more. So in a way, it's almost better theologically. You know, these guys were like thrown in the fire and all that stuff that we're going to read about later. Like being castrated was also a very big deal. Prisoners of war and slaves were castrated. All right, so what does Josephus, the first century historian, say about all this? Most likely probably reflects the consensus view. But now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took some of the most noble of the Jews that were children, probably teenagers, and the kinsmen of Zedekiah, their king, such as were remarkable for their beauty of their bodies and comeliness of their countenances, and delivered them into the hands of tutors, eunuchs. These tutors were eunuchs, and to the improvement to be made by them. He also made some of them to be eunuchs. So he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, taking children and making them into eunuchs, which of course he took also with those of other nations. So he did this with all kinds of nations, not just the Jews. Now among these, there were 4 of the family of Zedekiah of most excellent dispositions, the one of whom was called Daniel. Another was, and then he gives the other 3 people. Now among these what? Among these eunuchs. Josephus is saying that Daniel and his 3 friends were eunuchs. So he made some of them to be eunuchs. Among these eunuchs were Daniel and these other three guys. Josephus believes they were eunuchs, and there's no mention of Daniel and these guys ever getting married or anything like that. And the word that Josephus uses for eunuch is not evnuchos, it's ektomias. And this word is used by some other Greek writers, such as Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BC, 1 century after the events of Daniel. And he writes, "From Babylon and the rest of Assyria came to Darius 1,000 talents of silver and 500 castrated boys." So that's a lot of castrated boys. And he also uses the word ektomias in the plural in reference to castrated boys. So you see this word ektomia is not in relation to government officials in the court of the king. It's simply a reference to castrated boys. So Josephus uses this word in reference to Daniel and his three friends because he says, among these. So Josephus is saying that they were eunuchs, and that was the standard interpretation. Now, this word ektomias is used only once in the Greek Old Testament in Leviticus 22:24, talking about animals. Any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you shall not offer to the Lord. So it has a blemish, right? So that's the word ektomion in relation to castrated animals. You cannot offer those castrated animals in a sacrifice. And Herodotus uses this word one more time. If they are defeated in battle, they will be enslaved. We will make eunuchs of their boys and carry their maidens captive. So according to a 5th century BC historian, it was a common practice to castrate the boys of the nation who was defeated in battle. And that's exactly what happened to the Jews. This is from Jerome around the 4th century. The Hebrews, which are the Jews, to the present day affirm that the three youths, and really the four, including Daniel, were eunuchs. So Jerome, he's the guy who wrote the Latin Vulgate, is saying that the Jews to the present day, starting back with Josephus, they still believed that Daniel and his three friends were eunuchs, and Jerome agrees with them. Scripture foretold that there should be eunuchs of the seed royal. These men were those who were made eunuchs. Daniel and his three friends were those eunuchs prophesied by Isaiah 100 years previously. So this is pretty much unanimous interpretation of that this prophecy, Isaiah 39:7, your sons will be taken away and they will be made eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Most people in the early church and the Jews back then believed that this prophecy was fulfilled with Daniel and his three friends. They were made eunuchs in Babylon. But aren't eunuchs kind of defiled and they're not allowed in the assembly? Isaiah goes on to say, let not the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree, for this says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who basically are, remain loyal to the covenant they're in. Hold fast my covenant, which says right there. I will give them an everlasting name. They shall not be cut off. Some things were cut off, or their body, by the Babylonians, but God will not forsake them. It will all work out fine for them. They hold fast to my covenant, give them everlasting life, all that stuff. Now, here's eunuchs in Jeremiah. You have the word king, queen, and eunuch. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs. See, this is a different word for the officials, but then you got this other word for eunuchs. So this kind of implies that Israelites did have eunuchs. It basically says it right here. They had eunuchs. Eunuch in the king's house, there's officer, but in Greek it says eunuch. And the word eunuch is used about 7 times in the book of Daniel. That Daniel was not merely trained under the oversight of the chief eunuch or chief palace official, prince of the eunuchs of Nebuchadnezzar, but also himself became a eunuch in the proper sense and was trained in that capacity, is an ancient Jewish tradition which appears to rest on a combination of Daniel 1:3 with the prophecy of Isaiah to Hezekiah, Isaiah 39:7, where Saris was held to designate actual eunuchs. John Peter Lang, Commentary on Daniel. So Josephus thought that Daniel and his friends were eunuchs. It's in the Targum, it's in the Babylonian Talmud. Rashi And Origen, an early Christian church father, Origen, he was a bit wacky himself. In fact, Origen castrated himself. Origen was a eunuch. So I guess, of course, he thought Daniel was a eunuch, but Origen castrated himself because he thought that would make him more spiritual or something. He'd have less temptation. Not sure if that worked out for him or not, but Origen believed that Daniel and his friends were eunuchs. Jerome believed that. John of Damascus apparently believed that as well. Plenty of early church fathers believed that Daniel and his friends were eunuchs. The Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament says, the threatening oracle to Hezekiah predicts that his sons, or his descendants, will one day be Sarisim in the palace in the king of Babylon. So it's either officials or eunuchs, and is probably to be taken literally. Understanding the word here in the sense of chamberlain amounts to transforming a terrible punishment virtually into a privilege. That's what I said before. They were not being punished by becoming high officials. They were punished by becoming eunuchs. Opponents of the literal understanding of eunuch are offended because this forces the conclusion that Daniel and his companions, in whom the prophecies were fulfilled, were actually eunuchs. This, they argue, is contradicted by the following verse, which states they were young men without physical defect, which is verse 4, youths without blemish. Well, here's the thing, though. Let's think about this a minute. The arch-eunuch was commanded by the king to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance. That's how he found them in Jerusalem. So when this eunuch went to Jerusalem, he looked around and he found the good-looking teenage young boys. They were without blemish, which could mean, in the Hebrew Bible, it could mean they were not castrated. There was no defect in them. Of course, they were not castrated when he found them. This is talking about what they were like when they were in Jerusalem before they were taken to Babylon. They would have been castrated in Babylon. So this is not a defense that they were not castrated. This is talking about how he found them in Jerusalem. They were without blemish when he found them, but then he brought them back to Babylon and changed their names. It sounds like there's some kind of initiation going on here, some kind of ritual. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. So they did have a limit. You can cut my balls off, but I ain't going to eat your food. Okay, now this is from the same article in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Probably not a few of the Jews became the victims of this bloody custom. A lot of Jews must have been castrated by their enemies. From Edward Young's commentary on Isaiah, not of their own volition do these descendants go to Babylon. They will be taken. The destiny that awaits them is that of being eunuchs in the palace of the Babylonian king. Now here's from the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature. They're talking about eunuchs, and then it says, it is probable that Daniel and his companions were thus treated as eunuchs in fulfillment of 2 Kings 20:17 and Isaiah 39:7. Some scholars believe this was fulfilled with Daniel and his three friends actually becoming eunuchs. And this source here says probable. Faith Life Study Bible. The Old Testament tells us that Isaiah prophesied to King Hezekiah about a day when the Babylonians would attack and capture Jerusalem, taking some of the sons of Israel to be made saris in the royal courts. Saris means eunuchs. That prophecy was fulfilled in Daniel's day. Here's the Jewish Encyclopedia. According to rabbinical tradition, Daniel was of royal descent, and his fate, together with that of his three friends, was foretold by the prophet Isaiah to King Hezekiah in these words, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. According to this view, Daniel and his friends were eunuchs. Jerome said, the conclusion is that if Daniel and the three youths were chosen from the seed royal, and if Scripture foretold that there should be eunuchs of the royal seed, these men were those who were made eunuchs. These men, meaning Daniel and his three friends. Most likely, Isaiah's prophecy was fulfilled, beginning with Daniel and his friends, and it would have included many other young boys being carted off to Babylon and being castrated as well. So for me, I'm kind of wondering, how do I think of this? I think it's possible. At the very least, let's start conservatively. I would say it's definitely possible Daniel and his three friends were changed into eunuchs, not by choice, but because they were basically captives and brought into the court of the king. And their boss was chief of the eunuchs, which meant that he was the manager of eunuchs. And if your manager's the manager of eunuchs, it kind of means that you're a eunuch too. It's kind of basic common sense, and it's contextually based. All right, it's really, it doesn't say Daniel and his friends were eunuchs, but it's in that context, it seems like they were. And according to this prophecy we're looking at right here, this prophecy was fulfilled in the time of Daniel. Now, Daniel and his friends were not the only people to go to, Babylon, so somebody must have become a eunuch here. Some Jewish kids were turned into eunuchs. That has to have happened. And why wouldn't Daniel and his friends be eunuchs? That's really the question. So I'm kind of agreeing now with this comment. I was thinking it was possible. Now I'm kind of thinking it's probable. The inner circle of the king was full of eunuchs. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. So well, if he was castrated already, he's kind of defiled. See, the chief of the eunuchs is Daniel's boss, basically. So if your boss is the chief of the eunuchs, it kind of implies that you're a eunuch too. So I'm not saying this is 100% guaranteed that Daniel and his friends were eunuchs, but I think it's likely they were. It just kind of makes their situation that much worse, which makes their liberation that much better. And in fact, personally, in my opinion, I would be surprised if they were not eunuchs, just because in context, that's how it was back then. And we also have that prophecy from Isaiah that is being fulfilled. So if there were not eunuchs, how could they not be eunuchs? Come on, my cat's a eunuch. These guys were like pets. Look at the word eunuch is all over the place. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I mean, it's like the chief of the eunuchs is thinking, I already cut your balls off. I guess it's okay that you don't have to eat. He's having compassion on Daniel. He's like, yeah, man, it must be quite a shock. Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel and his friends, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. So there's a steward. Now, the steward must have also been a eunuch, right? Chief of the eunuchs. Everyone under the chief of the eunuchs must have been a eunuch. And also, by the way, so the food, it very likely was offered to idols, right? And, it was just they considered it to be unclean food. So the steward, probably also a eunuch, took away their food and their wine and they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So it looks like Daniel was now a castrated vegetarian. These are things they don't tell you at church, by the way. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill. God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. Among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Notice they're using their Hebrew names here. Therefore, they stood before the king. And notice the word eunuch is right next to the word king once again in the same sentence. You see it all the time. Let me highlight that. King, eunuch, right? Very closely related. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That was about 66 years later or so. Remember, the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah was 70-year kingdom of Babylon that ruled over all the other nations. The Jews were in captivity for roughly 66 years or so. So Daniel was basically there his entire life from being a young teenage boy. He's probably around 13 or something. He has a spirit inside of him, so which I believe is the Holy Spirit. So God is with him. So even in his darkest hour, he's been enslaved, taken away to Babylon. They may have cut off his balls. He's eating vegetables. He's a castrated vegetarian in Babylon. How much worse can it get? But God is with him. So no matter how bad it gets, God can help us. See you.